All right. Judges. Now, if you have an opportunity to look online and see my title, we might finish. In fact, that's my overall goal, finishing the book of Judges tonight. It begins, obviously, with Samson. The verse I picked for this area is actually dealing with Samson. Samson calling upon the Lord and said, "Oh, Lord, please remember me, and please strengthen me just this time, O God, that I may at once be avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Samson, man, it's excellent Sunday school fodder. It reads well. It kind of like it meets some fascinations. There's some amazing truth to that. People want to be strong, little boys. You look around, and all the little girls want to be nice Delilahs. Nobody. Wow. Okay, I'll work on that. I thought that would at least get some kind of an uproar, because honestly, how do you supposed to? What's the Sunday school lesson from Samson? Think about it. If you're trying to teach kids the story of Samson, and you're going to go ahead and teach them this particular Sunday school lesson, what's the overall moral of the story? Don't be involved with women? I don't know what it is. So what we have to do is take it away from the Sunday school just fascination and actually kind of look at it from the perspective of what the Bible is actually trying to do here. Let's go ahead and quick review. This is going to be part 2. The oppression of the Philistines in pursuit of the Israelites, that is God pursuing the Israelites, places them under rule of the Philistines for 40 years. It takes 40 years to get Israel's attention. And then Samson is chosen as the judge who will deliver Israel. The call of Samson is unique. It's not like the other judges. He is not called as a man. He is called before he is born. And his parents' job was to raise him devoted to God through the vow of the Nazarite, which we looked at the vow of the Nazarite last week. We'll take a look at it again near the end of this particular account. We looked at a bride for Samson and a lion's tail. As a young man, God stirred in Samson so that he would ask for a bride from the Philistines. The scenario led to a few encounters, opportunities, so that Samson would fight against the Philistines, including the treachery of the Philistines in winning a wager, which he was basically said, well, since you're going to go ahead and be deceptive and treacherous, I'm going to do the same thing. And he was right to do so. He was acting in defense of Israel, and Israel was under the occupation and oppression of the Philistines. We often take a look at the life of Samson and say, he's just doing things haphazardly. And instead, looking at it from the perspective that he is a judge, a man of faith, doing things in accordance with God's will. When in the section where Samson continues his fight, Samson takes revenge against the Philistines for the murder of his once betrothed and kills a bunch of Philistines, and then he burns the crops of the Philistines. The Philistines chase Samson to Judah, but it's a trap. Not for Samson, but for the Philistines. And he kills 1,000 men with a jawbone of a donkey. That's where we left off. It's in Judges 16 where we left off. Now, before we get there, but we have to make sure we understand what we have said so far, not only in the content of the account, but also in what exactly is going on. Again, so far we have some very interesting details in the early life of Samson. Many have debated about what is behind this mayhem, and if you read it again, it's kind of like it's just craziness. Some think that Samson is immature and is just doing things haphazardly, as I said, as the Lord is spurring him into action without any real plan. God has a plan. Samson doesn't know what he's doing. He's just going crazy. Others say that the Spirit of the Lord coming upon him not only endowed Samson with the amazing ability, it also gave him amazing mind for trickery and strategy. Okay? The whole scenario was actually being planned by Samson. Not necessarily all the details, but the actual going in, I'm going to go down there and I'm going to continue to look for opportunities to fight against these people as I am God's deliverer of Israel and fighting against the Philistines. Based upon the fact that Samson created riddles, songs, and was poetic in battle, I think Samson knew the plan and carried it out in accordance with the leading of the Lord. There's no indication that Samson was unaware of the plan of God. In fact, in Judges 15, he says in chapters 15, verse 18, he said, he became thirsty and called upon Jehovah and said, you have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant. That your servant, again, it's a different derivative, but it's similar to that which is used by Moses and by Joshua. And now shall I die in thirst and fall in the hands of the uncircumcised. He knew what he was doing. He wasn't just kill everybody in sight. It was, I understand I'm being used as a deliverer here, and he's calling upon the Lord. In Judges 15:20, we see the end of that particular section where it basically says, and he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. So what is recorded is a sampling of the events of Samson. The fact that he judges Israel for 20 years indicates that there were many situations and conflicts along the way. Do you think this is it? It's done, and then the story of Samson and Delilah, is that the only two things that are important in his life? He was supernaturally empowered, and it was enabled to have perpetual victory over the Philistines. If this is all we had, if the story ended in verse 20, what would we conclude about Samson? Now, the next section does have impact because it's told. But at the same time, it's the end of his life. It's not the beginning of it. There's questions about chronology here and how long all this actually it takes. But still, let's go ahead and say that the Judges 16 is the final year. What are we going to say about the first 19 years of his ruling as a judge? We have to understand that we don't get all the information, but at the same time, we often fill the gaps. And we think Samson to be some type of grown child, some type of man-child. And we really need to be careful about how we talk about people, especially in the Judges and David and these individuals, because if they're called a man of faith and is in the hall of faith in Hebrews 11, I don't necessarily want to buck against the system according to what the Bible has to say. I'm saying this kind of emphatically with a little bit of sting in my voice, simply because there's most of the commentaries, in fact, all the commentaries, say that Samson as a judge is just indicative of the time of how bad Israel's gotten. And so the worst judge is saved for last. Of course, he's not the last judge. Anybody know who the last judge is? It's probably Samuel. Samuel was a great guy. So, I mean, if you're talking about the progression of judges goes from good to bad, then what do you do with Samuel? And Samuel was called basically from as a child as well. The theological impact that we have to look here is from just what are we doing with this passage? If you want to just read the story and just look at the history and understand the context of the overall plan or the kind of the thread of God's history through Israel, that's fine. But if you want to get some theology about this, what is the main point? Well, the main point of Samson is the main point of the Judges. It's a question of who is God, and the main theological impact is God is faithful to his promises, even though Israel is not faithful to her promises. They made a covenant relationship with God. They continually, perpetually break it. And Jehovah's there going, when it's appropriate, I will judge you, and when it's appropriate, I will save you. I am the Lord. So in Judges 16, I've titled this The Aftermath. Fix this. The aftermath. Why the aftermath? Because again, I want to demonstrate through the title here that this is not about Samson's life. This is about Samson's end. Now, I will digress in just for a brief moment and say I really don't know how long a time this spans over. A lot of people think this happens like within 3 days. Probably not. Okay? I would say that the fact that she's calling people, they're going back and forth, and she's trying to set the situation up, I believe has probably happened over at least a couple months, if not maybe a year or maybe even longer. I don't know. But the death of Samson is actually just as spectacular as the beginning. And it begins in Gaza. In chapter 16, verses 1 through 3, it says, "Now Samson went into Gaza and saw a harlot there and went into her." You're like, what? Samson, a judge, harlotry, forbidden. And when it was told to the Gazites, so basically the people of Philistine, saying, "Samson has come here," they surround the place and lay in wait for him all night at the gate of the city, and they kept silent all night, saying, "Let's wait until morning light, then we will kill him." Now Samson lay until midnight, and at midnight he arose and took of the doors and the city gates and 2 posts and pulled them up along with the bars, and he put them on his shoulders and carried them up to the top of the mountains, which is opposite Hebron. Just matter of factly, which I look at this and go, what exactly is happening here? The first 3 verses set the stage for the rest, okay? Samson is constantly being hunted by the Philistines. If you want to get the main point of how this part starts, it's not about the harlotry. It's not even about the great feat of strength in verse 3. It's about he's perpetually being hunted. Because that's exactly what happens in the rest of the chapter. He's perpetually hunted. They're consistently trying to trap him. They're always looking to ambush him. They're not trying to fight him in open war or to stand toe-to-toe with him, say, hey, let's fight. They want to try to trap him in some kind of weird situation where he's sleeping or right when he just wakes up. The immorality of Samson is neither condoned nor condemned. I think we can all say from the biblical framework that we know the immorality of Samson is not a good thing. But is that what is on display? It does lead to one important observation. Being controlled by sex is undoing of many godly people. We see that throughout the Bible. In fact, that's pretty much the point of 1 and 2 Timothy, where it talks about godliness and faith. The 2 things that we have to always be careful with when dealing with ministry is that we uphold godliness, which is morality. And we uphold faith, which means we don't allow false doctrines to creep in. That's the 2 main goals of any particular ministry. Make sure there's no immorality and make sure the doctrines don't get tainted. So Samson went to Gaza fully aware that he was the most powerful person, right? And he was obviously more powerful than the Philistines. In Gaza, he saw a harlot and went into her. And again, this was no indication like it was previously in Judges 14:4 that this was of the Lord, meaning God kind of spurning this situation on. When this was told to the Philistines of Gaza, they surrounded him and waited to ambush Samson all night at the city gate. The phrase, what does it say here? Let us lay here at the gate. Let us wait until morning. Probably doesn't mean they're just staying there silent all night long, staying awake. They're probably saying, hey, let's wait for this guy to wake up. And when he comes out, let's get him. It's rather than try to burn his house down or try to attack him there because he'll have a chance to defend himself. He's already fortified. But Samson doesn't wait. And we don't know how he knew of the trap. It just says that basically he got up at midnight, took hold of the doors of the city gates, the 2 posts, and pulled them up with the bars. And he put him on his shoulders. This is basically the city gate. What happens at a city? When a city is closed, it's shut. And that's locked. And he goes, I'm just taking the door with me. That's basically what happens. I can't imagine this. I really don't understand how this was possible, except for the supernatural endowment from God. But he picked up this entire gate, basically, along with the bars, and hiked about 10 miles. What would that have done if you would have saw somebody? If you're there waiting for somebody to kill him, you hear about this guy. Maybe you've encountered him before, maybe you have not. And all of a sudden you go, let's go ahead and wait outside the gate until this guy wakes up and let's kill him. And all of a sudden you wake up to this guy pulling the gate out of the blocks. You can go, no, thank you. Honestly, if you look at what this is going on here, it's obviously a feat of strength that would probably be a deterrent to his would-be assassins. That's how it starts. That's verses 1 through 3. Now you get the fall of Samson. And again, Samson and Delilah. This is always a constant, a little joke my wife and I play together, whenever she's trying to plead with me, asking over and over again. I go, okay, Delilah. And she's like, all right, I'll stop asking. Don't try that at home. I'm not condoning it. It has got me into trouble before. So here's a couple things before we actually look into this situation here. The story of Samson and Delilah doesn't take into account the prostitute situation from the first 3 verses. And the immorality of Samson in the first 3 verses does not play in this situation here. It's 2 different accounts. It doesn't say, hey, he went over there to the harlot, and now let's go ahead and talk about another harlot, which we'll talk about as well. They're not on display in this account. Immorality or harlotry is not even brought up in the next verses at all. So when we read this, it's actually, a very easy story to read. And Delilah is enticed to betray Samson. So he loved a woman. Verse 4 says, after this, it came about that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. Now, there's people that question Delilah because Delilah seems to be a name that appears to be an opposite of Samson. Like, for example, some people believe her name means darkness and Samson means light. It's his dark side. Some people think that it's basically somebody who is enticing. So it may not be a name, but it says clearly her name was Delilah. So I'm not going to say her name's not Delilah, but and oftentimes names get morphed into a meaning based upon what happened in previous situations. Okay, so don't try to look at the name and parse out that this is her character based upon this name. That's her name, and then character oftentimes gets tied to it later. Kind of like Delilah. You call anybody who names their daughters Delilah? I mean, isn't that just kind of giving them a bad future? Just out of curiosity. The lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, entice him and see where his great strength lies and how we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him. Then we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. So Delilah said to Samson, please tell me your great strength is and how you made bound to afflict you. What kind of question is that? Hey, can you imagine just going up to Superman and go, if Lois Lane went up to Superman, hey, tell me your weakness. And Superman's like, why do you want to know my weakness? And I don't know if this was actually the actual text. My impression of the text, reading it straightforward, is this is obviously truncated, right? I don't know how anybody can be this stupid if it was, right? If this was the actual conversation and it happened all about the span of about a week, Samson is the dumbest person ever to existed. And you really don't get that impression of Samson previously. Samson said to her, if they bind me with 7 fresh cords, he answers so, and again, he doesn't tell the truth here, but still, it's kind of, he answers her. If they bind me with 7 fresh cords that have not been dried, then I'll become weak and be like any other man. Then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh cords that have not been dried, and she bound him with them, and she had men laying in wait in the inner room. And she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he snapped the cords as a string of tow snaps when it touches fire, so his strength was not discovered. Now, the whole scenario plays out kind of interestingly here because it appears as though she has him in wait and to find out whether or not he is able to break free of his binds. We don't know if Samson knows about the other men in the room. I think that would be cause for Samson to be suspicious. But perhaps he just thinks she's playing a game, because the men doesn't say that they're out there. Why? Because if he's asleep and he's bound and they think that this is going to work, why not just attack him there? But instead, she says something to him to wake him up to see if he breaks out. Then Delilah said to Samson, behold, you have deceived me, and behold, tell me lies. Now, please tell me how you may be bound. He said to her, if they bind me tightly with new ropes, which have not been used, then I will become weak and be like any other man. So dried ropes now. So not the new, but the dried ropes. So Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson, for the men were laying in wait in the other room. But he snapped the ropes from his arms like a thread. Then Delilah said to Samson, up to now you have deceived me and told me lies. Tell me how you may be bound. And he said to her, if you weave that 7 locks of my hair with the web and fasten it with a pin, then I will become weak and be like any other man. So while he slept, Delilah took the 7 locks and his hair and wove them into the web, and she fastened it with a pin and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. I see a trend. But he awoke from his sleep and pulled out the pin out of the loom and the web. So he's like, you're just messing with you. Again, it appears as though they were in wait to find out whether or not his strength did in fact leave him. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily appear as though they're presenting themselves. Then she said to him, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have deceived me these 3 times and have not told me where your great strength is. It came about when she pressed him daily in her words and urged him so that his soul was annoyed to death. We've all been there. If not by our spouses, then by our children. And if not by our children, then, some other grandchildren or nieces or babysitting, So he told her all that was in his heart and said to her, a razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I will become weak like any other man. And we know the story, right? Delilah saw that she goes, I think he's truly being honest with me now. She calls for the Philistines to come back and causes him to fall asleep on her lap, and then brings a guy in to shave his head. Verse 20, she said, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And he awoke from his sleep and said, I will go out as other times and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. So we have this situation here where the Samson kind of gives up the secret, so to speak. Now, the fact that Delilah was enticed to betray Samson with money, even though it did happen, she betrayed him. The price was pretty steep. It's 1,100 pieces of silver from each person. Now, there is questions about the numbers, about how, 1,000 plus 100, if it's at least 1,000 kind of number. She could be bought, but the cost is high. This indicates that although she was enthusiastically seeks the betrayal of Samson, the initial relationship may have been thought to be true. I don't know. The question of Samson's gullibility, if it is here, is not answered in the text. Even after his hair was cut, he did not realize the Lord had left him and his strength would be gone. In verse 21, the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes, and they brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze chains, and he was a grinder in the prison. Now, a question is often asked about the hair. The strength of Samson did not reside in his hair. I think we understand that, right? That a lot of people, the story of Samson from an extra biblical concept, when people read or know the story of Samson, what was the source of Samson's great strength? And people, his hair. No, it is not. There are plenty of people with long hair that did not have great strength. And many people who are with less hair who are still quite strong. The vow of Yahweh as being with Samson is understood as conditioned as Samson being a Nazarite. You break that vow, he is no longer a Nazarite, or you break the vow of the Nazarite, and then he loses his strength. Why? Because as soon as he broke the vow of the Nazarite, Yahweh departed from him, because it says he did not know that Yahweh had, or Jehovah had actually departed, and Samson became weak because God was his strength. It was the supernatural endowment from God so that he would be able to fight the Philistines. Now, it's interesting because even though it clearly states in the text that getting a haircut would be his undoing, he said that, right? He still said, I will go out as other times and shake myself free. What does this indicate? That he didn't realize his hair was cut? I mean, I think if you wake up and your head is shaved, I think you kind of know. You know, there might be a nick or two. How do you sleep through that too, by the way? I'm not sure. But it may indicate that he, even though he told Delilah this, that he may not have been believing that God would actually leave him for breaking the vow. Maybe he said it. This is how you break a vow of a Nazarite. This is what I've been done. This is how, and he kind of just attributes it. But in actuality, God has my back and he's not going to let me fail. Instead, since he broke the law, the vow of the Nazarite, he did. Now, the fact that he was captured, his eyes gouged out, and was made to be a grinder. A grinder, basically a hand grinder. Now, some people have them kind of with that kind of like the rolling mill that goes in a circle and he has to push it with his whole body. This is probably closer to what the hand mill was. And it's basically you just get some meal, you get some corn, you get some other type of grain, and you just mill it down by hand. And a lot of people indicate this. Historically, this is probably the lowest of the lows for any type of work. That slaves were given this job because nobody wants to do it. It's like washing windows. And the actual is probably the hardest, and Greeks and Romans sentenced their slaves. If you're a slave and you get in trouble, you do this. In fact, people still do this in the East. And who does it? They're slaves. All throughout the Near and Far East, even into Africa, they still do this. And it's the slaves that do it typically. In verse 22, there's a foreshadowing. See it? However, the hair on his head began to grow again after it was shaved off. So he cut it. So in the fall stand, in verse 22, the story has a foreshadowing that the hair begins to grow back. And let's go over to Numbers chapter 6, verse 9. And let's just remind ourselves just something interesting about the story of the Nazarites and the vow of the Nazarite. Number 6. Now, again, they don't follow this to the letter. However, I want to just demonstrate something. Verse 9. If a man dies very suddenly beside him, and he defiles his dedicated head of hair, then he shall shave his head on the day when he becomes clean, and he shall shave it on the 7th day. Then on the 8th day he shall bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons to the priest, to the doorway of the tent of meeting. The priest shall offer one of the one for a sin offering, and the other for a burnt offering, and make atonement for him concerning his sin because of the dead person. And that same day he shall consecrate his head. He shall dedicate to the Lord his days as a Nazarite. He's reinitiating the Nazaritic oath. So even though he shaves his head and kind of like violates or becomes unclean, he can reinitiate the vow of the Nazarite. The fact that his hair begins to grow back, I think, is kind of helping us understand. I think that statement was there going, his strength can be restored. It's kind of like that glimpse of hope that his hair begins to grow back. Now, exactly how does Samson reinitiate himself? I don't know. Again, this is told in a very telling format, but at the same time, this is how it's stated. Now, what happens next? In verse 23 through 27, the lords of the Philistines assembled to make great sacrifices to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice. For they said, our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hands. And what do? They get plastered. And they party. And they party hard. Okay? It happened when they were high in high spirits, that they said, call for Samson, and he may come and amuse us. Remember, you have a blind guy who has been beaten, has been working with his hands on this mill, slave labor style, and he's probably weakened. He's probably tired, and they're probably making sport of him. And they staged, and the stage is set for Samson's final victory. In verse 26, they called for Samson, verse 25, from the prison, and he entertained them. I don't know if he did a song and dance. I don't know if he did some magic tricks. I don't know exactly what it meant by he entertained them. Probably they're just poking him with sticks and stuff. And they made him stand between the pillars. Then Samson said to the boy who was holding his hand, let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, that I may lean against them. Now the house was full of men and women, and all the lords of the Philistines were there. And about 3,000 men and women were on the roof looking on while Samson was amusing them. Then Samson called to the Lord and said, O Lord God, please remember me and please strengthen me just this last time, that I may once be avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, and braced himself against them, the one on the right and the other on the left. And Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. And he bent with all of his might, so that the house fell on the lords and the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he killed in his life. Then his brothers and all of his father's household came down and took him, brought him up, and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah his father. Thus he had judged Israel 20 years. So far, we've seen some of the most iconic situations played out in Sunday school history, right? But there are some preconceived notions in which we need to understand first and foremost. First, Samson loved the ladies. Is that true? Meaning that he was a womanizer. He set up a marriage, a staged marriage, to hide opportunity. Was he a womanizer? He went into one woman who's a harlot. Judah did the same thing. Several other people did the same thing. David also, stole a woman. Does it mean that he's a womanizer? That's a conclusion a lot of people make, but that's not what the text says. Now, does he have a kind of like a soft spot for telling women his secrets? Yes. Does that mean he's a womanizer? Actually, he's probably like a little big soft teddy bear that can just be wooed over very easily, but it doesn't necessarily mean he's a womanizer. It concludes with Delilah. But again, who's Delilah? That's actually a very big mystery about who Delilah is. Here's another question, or another presumption, that Delilah was a Philistine. It's possible. It's not stated in the text who she is, right? When it comes down to Delilah, it says the lords of the Philistines, verse 5, came up to her, and they didn't entice her like the other time they enticed Samson's would-be wife, and said they would pay her. They didn't say, hey, you're one of us. Why are you with Samson? We don't know who Delilah is. She may be a Philistine. She may be an Israelite. We don't know. She may be from a different country. We don't know. But to read into that is being correct. That also Delilah is a harlot. Doesn't say that at all. He loved her. And people are like, well, did he love her, or did he just love her? Again, you're trying to read into the situation. Don't go beyond what is written. Allow what is written to be stated. Here's another one, typically, that Samson's relationship with Delilah was illicit and unlawful. Where does it say that? Now, it doesn't say that he got married, but it doesn't say he didn't get married. He's obviously with this woman for some time, right? And obviously dedicated to her. I'm not sure in his mind whether or not he was married or not, or whether or not they were married. And she just, yeah, I can become rich. It's like cashing in on a life insurance policy. You know, who knows? I don't know exactly what happens here. If you read it, the situation seems to have happened quickly, but we have no chronology of these events. Let's go ahead and say that this situation takes place over a year. Does that change how you see Samson's gullibility? That you're with somebody and you're having a relationship and you have a great time, you seem to be everything going smoothly, and she likes to know. She wants to know exactly what the secret is. And perhaps Samson doesn't know, because it doesn't say that Samson fought against the people who were in the inner room. It doesn't say that. So when you sometimes read a fictional story about Samson, or watch like the Bible, and you read all these things about how this occurs, there's a lot of artistic license that creeps into what we think is knowledge. How about this one? This is probably the biggest lesson. That Samson was endowed by God, powerful, judge over all of Israel. But Samson is judged for the sin of immorality. Are they reading the same Bible I'm reading? Is he judged for immorality? No. The Lord leaves him not because of immorality, but because he broke his vow. Even during the situation where we saw harlotry in chapter 16, verses 1 through 3, his strength did not leave him. He was still under the vow of a Nazirite, and that was basically, based upon the inference of chapters 15 and 16, we can see that Samson's great strength is simply because he kept the vow, which is two things. Don't drink anything, or don't even touch a grape, and don't cut your hair. I can't do anything beyond that. But this right here, this becomes the Sunday school fodder right here, right? No matter how good you think you're doing, you commit immorality, God's going to kill you. God's going to judge you. And it's not what it says. Now, I'm not saying go out and do that, but it's clear as though they're trying to read into the text. They're not reading it itself. Now, during Samson's victory, right, he basically said, let my soul die with the Philistines. Here's another good question, morally speaking, right? And he pushed the two pillars with force, and the house fell upon the princes and all the people who were within it. I couldn't find a good picture to represent this, but I kind of picture it like this. My search is kind of trying to find a place that where you had an open space with a roof. And if you have an open space, you have some pillars down here, and you just push on those pillars, and the whole thing comes crashing down. It's probably a big chain reaction where everybody in the base of the room and everybody on top of the room, they're all going to fall and probably be killed. But Samson's act was not suicide. There are many times people go to battle knowing they're going to die, and they say, I'm taking as many people with me. Is that suicide? It's an act of a hero who sees that it's necessary for him to be plunged in the midst of his enemies with the inevitable certainty of death in order to secure the righteous judgment and the deliverance of his people. What happens here? What is the theological impact of this particular account? The Lord proved to Israel and to the Philistines that even through Samson's death, God would not permit Israel to be under judgment perpetually, and the evil and godless Philistines would also be served up to righteous judgment. That's the lesson. You have Samson here who is evidently, we got him. See, our God's bigger than your God. Oh yeah, you're all dead. Through what? A selfless act of Samson. I find that to be not just a good ending to a story, but such an encouragement that this is the God that we have. This is the true God that sees both good and evil. And he is there, even though it may seem as though, it says in 1 Peter, being slow. to his judgments. He's not. He is patient and he's merciful. But at a point in time, what happens? He will judge. Now we can presume that the fact that Samson's brothers came to reclaim the body, that this terrible act of Samson, powerful act, obviously had an impact upon the Philistines. Not only the death of their princes and household and thousands of people who died, but also the temple probably where they were is probably the temple of Dragon, causing them to fear, not truly respect God, but to be terrified of him. And when Samson's brothers show up, they go, "We don't want anything to do with you, you brothers of Samson." Now, I'm reading into the text a little bit, but why would they allow Israelites to come retrieve their dead brother, other than do whatever you want to do? To conclude the statement, it's stated again, right? Thus, he judged Israel 20 years. This was the end of his judgment. Now we get into Judges 17 through 21, and it's the epilogue. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'm going to go ahead and run it through you. Why? I want to finish Judges. Not because I want to finish Judges, because to go through these texts a little bit would be a little bit monotonous, and it's not about a judge. Samson kind of concludes the body of the book of Judges, which sets forth the history of the people of Israel under the judges in a kind of a continuous, connected form, but not necessarily chronological. Remember, we said that before. These are not chronological events necessarily. I do think it kind of progresses through time, but it doesn't mean that one happened right after the other. Could be, it's more geographical. Where was Samson? Samson was near the coast, tribe of Dan, working his way south into Judah, dealing with the coastal territory of the Philistines. Gaza is still there today, and even though Israel had it at one point, they don't have it again. They will get it back in the future. The final 4 chapters brings about 2 main accounts. The first one is Micah, the Danites, and Israel's fall into image worship. Image worship becomes the main problem when you get into the divided kingdom of the north and south. Northern Israel and southern Israel, or Israel and Judah. Judah is the south, Israel is the north. What is the main problem of the north? Every king is evil. Why? Image worship or straight out idol worship. Dan becomes prominent. Why? Because they're the ones that set up the calf in the north, in the extreme north of Israel. The first account, which is basically Judges 17 through 18, Micah basically takes some money that he inherits and turns it into an idol or an image. He still talks about Jehovah. It mentions the Lord several times when he's talking. And he believes that he is actually worshiping God properly. In fact, it's interesting. He has an individual, a young man from Bethlehem in Judah, of the family of the Levites, was staying with Micah. And he basically conscribed him. He basically says, "Stay with me." Look at verse 10. Micah said to him, "Dwell with me and be a father and a priest to me, and I will give you 10 pieces of silver a year and a suit of clothes and your maintenance." So the Levite went in. He said, "Yeah, sure, sounds good. You're going to pay me to be your priest? Fantastic." The Levite agreed to live with the man, and the young man became to him like one of his sons. So Micah consecrated the Levite, and the young man became his priest and lived in the house of Micah. Then Micah said, "Now I know that the Lord," using the word Jehovah, Yahweh, "will prosper me, seeing I have a Levite as a priest." This is after he creates an image. It's like he can't read. Have you not read what the law says? And obviously, this is one of the conclusions we're going to see from this, is that the account demonstrates how the nation of Israel specifically, now it goes into Dan, I'll get there in a second, is in free fall from the law and ordinances of Jehovah God. Chapter 18 is about Dan. Now, Micah is kind of like a pre-story. Dan is really where it's at. And what happens in chapter 18 is they leave the area that was described to them, and they're going through all the different territories looking for a place where they can settle. And they send out spies. They get a kind of a weird type of fortune teller to tell them where they're going to go. And then they see Micah, and they see the idols and the images they create, and they steal them. Now, Dan is traveling with one of their largest groups. There are hundreds of soldiers and their family members. And Micah comes out and yells at them and says, "Hey!" And they go, "Why are you coming out against us?" He goes, "You stole my idols." He goes, and they go, "And?" And so Micah goes, "Well, you're pretty big and you have a lot of soldiers. So, yeah, oh well." But it kind of concludes with the fact that Dan took these idols, began this, and it's kind of alluding to what we're going to find in the future, that Dan becomes one of the biggest idol-worshiping tribes of Israel. Verse 29 of chapter 18, then they called the name of the name of the city Dan after the name of Dan, their father, who was born in Israel. However, the name of the city was former Laish. This tells you exactly where they kind of set up camp. The sons of Dan set up for themselves the graven image, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, he and his sons were priests to the tribe of the Danites until the day of the captivity of the land. And again, it's not necessarily idol worship at this point, it's image worship. They think they're worshiping Jehovah God in this form, and it's a fall from understanding. Israel had a severe inclination for idolatrous worship of Jehovah, and how this would continue until the Assyrian captivity of the northern portions of Israel. Why did the Assyrian captivity occur? Because they were idolaters. And they never got it right. Continue on with the epilogue. Judges 19 through 21 concerns a horrible act which the inhabitants of Gibeah in the territory of Benjamin attempted to commit upon a Levite who had a concubine, and he was traveling with his concubine, and they stayed in the town of Gibeah, and the people come out like they did in Sodom and wanted to rape the Levite, and did rape the woman. And in one of the statements that's made here, it goes, this has never occurred in Israel. This was something that happened outside of Israel. This was the evil that was on the outside, and Israel is now not doing it. In chapter 20, verse 1, it says, "Then all the sons of Israel from Dan to Beersheba, including the land of Gilgal, came out, and the congregation assembled as one man to the Lord at Mizpah. The chiefs and all the people of the tribes of Israel took their stand in the assembly of the people of God, 400,000 foot soldiers who drew the sword. And they went up against Benjamin because they did not punish this particular town who was in the territory." And what happens? Civil war. So a sin that has never been seen in Israel to that point, although it's not uncommon, caused a war with the tribe of Benjamin. And Benjamin nearly gets completely wiped out. What does this demonstrate about Benjamin? Benjamin was the strength of Israel. Paul is from the tribe of Benjamin, so we know that it perpetuates. But man, Benjamin was one of the good guys. It's not like Dan. This demonstrates that Israel has deep moral corruptions. And why? Because they influence the Canaanites. The Canaanites are the ones who do this kind of thing. But there's still a remnant that attempted to follow the law and follow Jehovah, both morally and spiritually. There were still some godly people out there. And so when they saw evil, they go, we got to deal with this. The interesting thing about the end of this story, though, is in chapter 21, they mourn the lost tribe. They mourn the loss of Benjamin, that they're nearly wiped out. And they cursed Benjamin too, saying, you can't have any of our women, and all your women are dead. And so they go, we don't want Benjamin to die off. And so they create this kind of convoluted type of unusual situation about how they can get women. And they're not going to go ahead and allow them to intermarry. They're going to make them wait by a field. And if there's any women that come out and dance, you can have one of those. Who makes this stuff up? Seriously. Even though that they are still trying to follow the law, both morally and spiritually, they're not doing a very good job. How do I know that? Verse 25, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Where do they get this type of rule that they're going to give away their women like this? They're doing what's right in their own eyes. In fact, there's in this section there is the statement "there is no king in Israel" is mentioned 4 times. There is no singular leader. There's not one person who is ruling over Israel. There's not one person who is doing what is right in Israel. In fact, just look at verse 24 and 25 again. The sons of Israel departed from there at that time, every man to his tribe and family, and each one of them went out from there to his inheritance. So they spread it back out again. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And to Judges, how do you feel? If you're reading the history of Israel and you read through Judges 21, you go, these people are doomed. They can't get it right. They just keep on falling farther and farther away, especially if you've read it from Genesis to Judges. You know their calling. You know their place in God's eyes. They've given the perfect law. They have a covenant relationship with God. They're supposed to have these rules upon them. They're supposed to be the light of the world. And what they're doing, they're looking more and more like the Canaanites, more and more like the nations around them. They're not being that light. You're wondering, how is Israel ever going to get out of this downward spiral? Right? Enter the king. Who? King David. But before David comes on the scene, you need some backstory. So next week, we get into Ruth. Why Ruth? What does this have to do with Judges? Well, remember, it's during the time of the Judges, but go to the end of Ruth chapter 4. I'll tell you the end before we even speak about the beginning. So Naomi, basically the mother-in-law of Ruth, took the child that Ruth had with Boaz and named him Obed. He is the father of Jesse. Jesse is the father of David. So Ruth and Boaz, Obed, Jesse, David. This is why Ruth is here. People are like, oh, Ruth's such a great story. It's a story about love. No, it's not. No, it is not. In fact, it's a story about how we get to David. And then 1 Samuel kind of concludes the Judges with the first king that the people choose, and then the true king, the king that God chooses, comes on the scene, and that's David. Let's go ahead and close in prayer, remembering the lesson so far. We'll get into Ruth. I don't know how long we're going to stay there. I might break it into four lessons, 4 chapters. I may teach it in 1. I haven't fully decided yet. I love the book of Ruth. It's worth telling the entire story. But at the same time, I want to make sure we do what we're set out to do, and that is go through the narrative so we can get to the understanding of the whole picture of the Old Testament, the Hebrew history, so we can get to the promise fulfilled, which is Jesus Christ in the book of Matthew. That's our overall main goal. And we'll see what we'll do. Whether I do it in 1 or 4, I think you'll enjoy the story of Ruth. If you have the time, and I wish you will, read it. It'll take you about 21 minutes. and we'll go ahead and discuss some of the details. Let's pray. God in heaven, thank you for your word. Thank you for your truth. Thank you for preserving the history of Israel, not only to demonstrate who Israel is and their problems, but also who you are, a true and loyal, faithful God who makes promises and keeps promises, the one true God, the only God, the one who created all things. And you love us, and you have made promises to us. And fortunately, unlike Israel during this time, it's not a promise we can break because you made it unconditionally. Thank you for that. We want to thank you and praise you and just think about you often, giving you all the glory and praise, for you are the one that is worthy. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. Thank you all, and we'll see you next time.